All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Kenny. I'm director of Glucksman Ireland House, and we're delighted to welcome you here this evening as we launch Immigration in American History by Hasia and Carl Bontempo, who will be in conversation with Maddalena Marinari. So, about 30 years ago, I'll tell you a story. When I had just moved to New York City and was setting out on my PhD, my mother and sister wrote to me to say they had just attended a wonderful public lecture in Dublin by an American professor of immigration history, and they purchased a copy for me in case I might ever wish to see the book. The book was called Erin's Daughters in America, Irish Immigrant Women in the 19th Century. The author was Professor Hasia, a renowned historian of Jewish America, who at that time was developing her decades-long interest in the American Irish as well. So that's how Hasia and I first met, as many historians do, through the printed word, long before we met in person. And I could have had no idea at that point how our lives and work would intersect in years and decades to come. Hasia Diner is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at NYU, a specialist in U.S. history. She has written and taught extensively in the fields of immigration history, American women's history, and American Jewish history. I'm not going to get all the books on this list, but I'll mention quite a few of them, along with Erin's Daughters in America. Hasia's books include In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935, A Time for Gathering, The Second Migration, 1820-1880, as part of the Jewish People in America series, Lower East Side Memories, Hungering for America, one of my favorites, Italian, Irish, and Jewish foodways in the age of migration. Will I keep reading the list? And many, and 3 or 4 more books I have on this list. Her book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, received the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies, as well as the Saul Weiner Prize for Outstanding Book in American Jewish History. Most recently, Hasia edited the massive, monumental Oxford Handbook of the Jewish Diaspora, and she is working now on a book, I've read the manuscript, on Irish and Jewish interactions in America. One of the themes that's always been dear to our hearts here in Ireland House, and to the hearts of the founders of the house, Lou Glucksman and Loretta Brennan Glucksman. Speaking of Ireland House, Hasia's finest accomplishment from our internal perspective, never mind all those books, is that she agreed to serve as interim director of the house in 2017-18 during the transition from Joe Lee's tenure. Not only that, but she served as chair of the committee that hired me as Glucksman Professor of Irish Studies at NYU, and so the wheel came full circle from Erin's Daughters to that. Hasia wrote Immigration in American History with Carl Bontempo, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening. Carl is Associate Professor of History at the University at Albany State University of New York, the author of Americans at the Gate, the United States and Refugees During the Cold War, and numerous essays and chapters on refugees and human rights in American history. So Hasia will be in conversation with Maddalena Marinari, Associate Professor of History at Gustavus Adolphus College, who flew in from Minnesota this morning. Tells me she's enjoying the warm weather in New York. You just should have seen last week when it was in the 70s. Maddalena is author of Unwanted, Italian and Jewish mobilization against restrictive immigration laws, 1882 to 1965. She's co-editor of A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, which looks at immigration during the so-called restriction era between 1924 and 1965, when about 7 million immigrants came to the United States and 4.7 million Bracero workers. So looking at that neglected period, along with Erica Lee, Maddalena recently co-edited a special issue of the Journal of American History. It's the centenary now of the immigration restriction laws of the 1920s, and actually I had the honor to contribute an article to that as well. Professor Marinari also serves on the History Advisory Board of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. One final serendipitous note, Professor Marinari is currently Vice President and President-elect of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, the main scholarly organization in the field. Hasia is past president of that organization. I'm current president of that organization when I'm not moonlighting as director of Ireland House. And actually, seriously, one of my goals during my tenure here has been to place our field of Irish history in the context of migration and diaspora. And it's just really a great pleasure for me to be able to bring the Immigration Ethnic History Society together with Glaxo Ireland House this evening. So that was kind of a long introduction, but I think it was merited. What we're going to do is for the next 15 or 20 minutes, Maddalena and Hasia will be in conversation about the book, and then we're just going to open it up. There's going to be, if we can't find things to say about immigration together this evening, I know we can. So we want to leave a lot of time for interactive discussion. So welcome both.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Thank you for making the time and to be with us tonight. It's also, I have to say, an incredible honor to be here with Hasia, who is one of my intellectual heroes, but also an incredible mentor and a model for how to be a supportive academic, especially to younger people. So it's fantastic. So what I thought I would do, I would ask some broad questions to pique your interest in this fantastic book. It's really too bad that Carl is not here with us today. And then turn it over for questions, essentially. I'll start with the obvious one. Why did you decide to write this book?
Right, okay, so thank you. And also I want to thank you for the too long introduction. Really, it's such a pleasure to be back here. And I feel it's like my second home on campus. I feel very much part of this institution. I think I say that every time I come to an Ireland House event, that you all are so wonderful to me. So this book has a kind of origin story that's different than many of the other projects I've done, in as much as I was approached by Yale to do this. And it was in the summer of 2016. And my first reaction was no, it's too big. There has been so much new scholarship, particularly on the more recent decades, that is since the 1960s, that I don't really feel all that qualified to say something that's important. But it was the summer of 2016, and if you can think back to then, there was somebody running for president. He had a big head of orange hair, and he made immigration not only an issue, but used language that to me was so appalling about bad hombres and rapists. And I decided, again, unlike any other project that I've ever done, that I had, in fact, a moral obligation as a citizen who is a historian, to say something and to undermine what seemed at the time, and I don't think I was so wrong, a kind of compelling narrative that people around the country were kind of eating up and kind of agreeing with him in those the clips of those rallies where he would say that those things were, on the one hand, extremely familiar as a historian, and this could have been anti-Irish rallies in the 1850s, but the fact is I didn't live then, I'm living now, and now I have an obligation to do it. So I went back to Yale after turning them down twice and saying I'd be happy to do it, but I wanted a co-author. And I wanted somebody who brought a couple things to the project that I didn't have. And besides the fact that I wanted somebody who was younger and who was more in tune with the current scholarship, okay, and who had a much more sharply defined focus on the law. Okay, and on policy. I consider myself primarily a social historian, and in my writing in the past, I think even in my teaching, the law always trotted up from behind. And I understood that that was not the way to do it, certainly at this moment in time, and certainly looking at the period from the 20s on. And so I chose Carl because of his really wonderful book on refugee policy. It also had to be somebody who was physically close enough to New York because it was before the pandemic, and we used to actually always meet at Grand Central Station and have really fantastic conversations there. We didn't always agree, but that was one of the really stimulating parts of the process, was kind of thrashing these issues out. But it really was a project that came to me, and the political moment seemed so compelling.
I think it's interesting. There isn't one migration scholar that I can think of that didn't have those kinds of reflections in 2016, right? I remember being at a conference, the Social Science History Association, where about 10 of us said, okay, we need to meet. What are we going to do? And I think for a lot of us, it was a wake-up call, right? A lot of us started writing for a broader audience or more accessible scholarship, right?
Right.
I want to build on your last point. So you were two authors, and historians usually don't write together. We're not very good at that.
Right.
How did you navigate that?
Right. So I wrote essentially the first half of the book. He wrote the second half, but we read each other's drafts, and we, I think, enriched each other's perspective. But I was much more comfortable with the period up to the 1920s. He was much more comfortable with the period after the 1920s. And so I think it was really a very good working relationship. I think we had very different writing styles. And
What are some of the disagreements?
well, yeah, that's a good question. So first, he articulated the point, and it actually shows up in the introduction because I decided not to argue with him about it, that he thinks that the issue of Mexican immigration was the through line. And I'm still not convinced that that's the case. And if I wanted to say there's a through line, I actually think the Irish provide that through line. So that was a difference. He was much more committed to the literature that came out since the 90s on whiteness, and that European immigrants became. And I was very convinced, not just because of my reading of the material, but through the work of someone like Thomas Guglielmo, that they were white upon arrival. And that while they became middle class, while they became respected, but the fact of the ability to become naturalized and to become citizens mattered in the most profound way. And it wasn't just, oh yes, they could vote, but rather they had access to power, and they could mobilize and get people above them to listen in a way that those who were not citizens couldn't. And therefore, I thought, to me, the whiteness argument, it was a moment in historical time. It has it continues to be invoked, but I just don't think that was the story. And I think I won on that one.
I wish you were here to
defend himself.
or give his side. You already made a couple of references to this, but given where we are tonight, What does your book say about Irish immigration? What did we learn?
Right. I think in some ways the Irish provide the kind of shock troops for America's engagement with immigration, with immigrants they don't like, okay, with immigrants whose mere physical being shocked the nation, and the nation at that point was almost predominantly Protestant, and a nation that thought of itself as a Protestant nation, that viewed Protestantism and some kind of fictitious Anglo origins as the core of the nation. And here are these millions of people coming in, and they're just being there, they riled up the American population. And in a way, they set the stage for what is to follow. And their high level of political activism from almost the get-go, again, convinced me about the importance of naturalization and citizenship. And it's a story that's repeated. Okay, and it's kind of, as I said, in those rallies that I was watching, I was thinking this could have been the know-nothings. And the words they're saying are exactly the same, just change a couple adjectives here, change the names of the group, name of the group that they think are somehow will never become American, who are degrading the national core, who are bad hombres, so they wouldn't have used the word hombre. It's the same language, and there was something almost deja vu, boringly familiar about it. And I think it's the Irish who really force the nation to deal with that, and in a sense kindled anti-immigrant nativism that we obviously know has never completely subsided. And I think that their creation of communities that were very much intended to deal with the implications of their own immigration becomes the model that other communities followed.
So I'm going to make a confession. I actually assigned this book. I'm directing an independent study, and the student read very carefully
Okay.
the book. And she had a similar reaction to something that you just said a moment ago, where she was having a hard time distinguishing what was in the past and what's happening now. Mm-hmm. And so, as my last question before I turn it over to the audience is, how does this book help us understand some of the, shall we say, passionate debates about immigration, belonging, and citizenship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first, and it may be, I'll answer that partly by indicating something that I should have maybe answered in the first question, which is most of the one-volume histories that we have had have always been written, this group, this group, right, this group, this group, which I just always found very unsatisfying. And I think one of the issues in the present is that I think we need to stop thinking about individual groups with individual structures, individual issues, and that immigrants as a class share much more in common with each other regardless of where they came from. And the tendency to say, well, those are the good ones, those are the bad ones, is not helpful for us understanding the nature of immigration as a force in American life. I think your students' reaction that, gee, I think I read this before in chapter 2, now I'm reading it again in chapter 5, although they're a different cast of characters, is the point. Okay, that the arguments don't change. The arguments were always wrong, okay, or they were always fallacious. Immigrants don't take jobs away from Americans. They actually do the work that Americans don't do. Okay, won't do. Immigrants, there is no immigrant population that doesn't become American, that doesn't, over the course of the number of generations doesn't matter, that doesn't acquire the basic skills of belonging, be it language, loyalty, service to the nation, and there is no population that is unassimilable.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn it over to the people in the audience. Since we have two different groups, I hope you don't mind if I ask the A, you say your name and try to not yell, but, have loud enough so that I can hear you. And I will be repeating questions so that each side knows what the other one is asking, if that makes sense. Do I have any volunteers? Who's going to go first?
Great.
No
Break the
pressure.
ice.
I'm Anna Law. I'm going to ask you a presentist question since I am not a historian. I do I'm persuaded by your point that a lot of the nativism and xenophobia we see today, we've seen that before. Is there really nothing new under the sun, though, about this current iteration of nativist spasm? Wait, I don't know the answer. That's why I'm curious to.
I think every immigration historian is wondering the same thing.
Yeah.
So if you didn't hear, sorry, I'll
sorry.
repeat. Yeah. Is there in the current debate about immigration and the language that is being used today, is there anything that is new?
Right, so that is one of the questions that Carl might be able to answer better than I, but I'd say the means of surveillance of immigrants is something new because of the technology. And, somebody in 1850, something in 18, so we know from one of Carl's students, he wrote, Hidetaka Hirota, who wrote about New York and Massachusetts in the 1840s and 50s trying to prevent paupers from coming in. They had no power of surveillance. I mean, the possibility of getting off a ship, no matter how much of a pauper you were, and just getting out there and being lost was totally the norm. Now, the level of tracking and the level of surveillance and the militarization of surveillance is something that's new, although it's not necessarily new immediately. It certainly goes back to the 1940s, maybe even a bit earlier, but it's the technology makes it. Otherwise, I'm not sure that there's much else that's different.
So this is a question that I've been thinking a lot about. And as I wrote in the introduction to the special issue that Kevin referenced, some of the things that we're seeing today were like the worst case scenarios in the 1920s. So using religion to exclude, like the Muslim ban, right? There's no precedent to that. Or using the pandemic. So the building blocks are in the past, but how comprehensive some of these measures have been, I think, are new.
Even though that obviously didn't have, it was a short lifespan for the Muslim ban.
Right.
So,
but Title 42, right, is still with us,
Right,
with the Biden administration, right? And it's very much in the news this week.
Right.
I'm wondering if you see in recent immigration signs of immigrants having a strong political impact on American politics, the way Irish immigrants were starting to do in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jewish and Italian immigrants and their children were beginning to do by the 1920s. Are you seeing anything like that happening today? Because when I think of New York City, we're 40 years into a heavy period of immigration, but I wouldn't say immigrants who are powerful political presence in the city today the way they were in the past. I think there are all sorts of reasons for that.
Okay, that's.
Sorry, I want to make sure
I'm
that,
sorry.
were you able to hear? Yes, okay, thank you, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think they're certainly active, and all the candidates have to go to this community and that community and make their case about why they are supporters of issues involving India, Pakistan, Chinese Americans. So, that kind of, you could put it in a negative word, pandering. I don't think it's pandering. I think it's saying, look, you are now part of the society and your vote counts. And if you want, if you have certain goals, certain policies vis-a-vis your own needs here in the United States or homeland issues, you have to speak up and be part of the political process. So I think that is very much still with us. it would be interesting to see the makeup of, for example, the congressional delegations and how many represent, the grandchildren of the immigrants who came in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a different political system now, or it's a different political reality. I think the political activism of African Americans didn't exist when the Irish, I mean, they were essentially just, nearly all of them were living under slavery, so therefore not a competing political force, and even for a long time thereafter, voting was essentially a white enterprise, and so that gave greater possibilities for not just Irish, but Italians, Jews, Poles, and so on, to make themselves heard. But I think that one could look at minutely and see that maybe there's somewhat a slowing of that process, but I think it's the same process.
Yeah, it made me think actually what you said earlier about citizenship, right? Those who naturalize are very active. I think the issue is that status, like we have a much broader range of statuses today in our immigrant communities that we perhaps did 100 years ago. Like even staying legal is much harder. And right now, becoming a citizen is prohibitive because it's much more expensive, right? That's another thing that happened during the Trump administration.
Okay, and I think I also want to add that since we are here in Ireland House, one of the contributions of the Irish political machines in every city was, essentially to get people who weren't even qualified to become citizens and get them to vote. And so there was a lot of what is fraudulent voting, but it gave power to these new immigrants.
Kevin.
Thank you, Hasia and Maddalena. So, I mentioned in my remarks, and actually Maddalena also alluded to the recent special issue in the Journal of American History, which is the flagship journal in the field, marking the centenary of the immigration restriction laws in the 1920s. And we had a webinar on that actually this time last week, at this time. Thursday. And one of the questions that came up in chat on the webinar, and we didn't get to it, but the question was, can any of you, this is a question to the panelists, can any of you think of something good to say about American immigration? And it wasn't one of the questions that we got to, right? But I was stumped because the conversation we were having, right, was all about policy, citizenship, restriction, and just at that moment, if it had come to me, and so I thought of a really good answer afterwards. But I was just wondering, Hasia, because I know you touch on this in the conclusion to the book pretty explicitly. If you look at immigration, and the question is, what is it that you might say in the book that's good in some sense about the history of immigration?
Well, I mean, so for one thing,
Sorry, this side did not hear. Is there, so this came up as a question in a webinar that we had last week. Someone had asked, can anyone say anything good about American immigration? And so Kevin is now asking that question to Hasia.
Well, I first want to ask the person what they meant by that, because I think there's so many different ways you could parse their question. But the good is that we're here, and on a very personal level, I can't but think if my parents had not come to the United States, they would have ended up in Auschwitz or in some ravine, having been shot by an Einsatz group in Ukraine. So I can't be anything other than say, it was a phenomenal experience, but that's true for so many people, not necessarily that particular narrative, but most people are better off that they came to the United States than not. But I think the other way of parsing that question, is there a good part of this story? Is it a story just of restriction and of anti-immigrant sentiment? And yet I think throughout this period, throughout this long period that we're talking about, there were always Americans, that is people who were not part of a particular immigrant wave, who reached out and who saw that the immigrants, whoever they were human beings who were going to become American, who were going to become citizens, who needed to be assisted, be it learning English, be it learning the skills that they could use in the marketplace. And I was reminded of this when these busloads of people were being sent from Florida and Texas, and the reaction in, I don't know, they go to Martha's Vineyard, and the people come out and give them places to stay and clothing and food. And, you know, I'm on how many different listserv in New York here for a group that meets people at the bus station coming up from Florida. I think that's always been there, not necessarily in that form. And so it hasn't been just about anti-immigrant sentiment and nativism and xenophobia, but it's also about, you know, kind of we're all citizens. We are all either citizens or potential citizens, and we're members of this community.
Yeah, and I asked my students the same question in class this morning. I can come up with lots of great answers, and I agree with everything you're saying. My point was that in a particular kind of conversation we were having, that question seemed incongruous because we were so focused on the negative. My answer, if I'd been thinking on my feet in a policy conversation, would have been birthright citizenship.
Okay.
Birthright citizenship
Absolutely.
is
Okay.
a great thing. Whether I would have been quick-witted enough to say that at the time, I don't know.
Right.
But I think it's also important to recognize that these are, you know, that these forces are always happening at the same time, right? Because sometimes we often favor one over the other. But I don't think we can deny that immigration laws are tools of social engineering. But there is also, in this moment, as Hasia was saying, there are people who fight for immigrant rights, who welcome these immigrants, right? I think sometimes it's dealing with the complexity that is a little bit challenging, right?
Well, I think as historians, the question is, what story do we tell first? And what's the engine that's driving the narrative or the history at a particular moment in time? And how you choose to prioritize one, make one the first thing you say and the other the second, tends to stack the deck. And I think it's much more dramatic to talk about nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, and then the law following and the policy, and kind of putting, oh yeah, and there were, but those were also people who, you know, in the 19-teens, 1920s, thinking about cultural pluralism and how do we train social workers, how do we train teachers, how do we find ways to bring people together, and, you know, there are all these books, you know, called Americans All, and those were, however hokey they seem now, they were efforts to say where you came from really doesn't matter. We are Americans all.
Right. Other questions?
I have a question. You're talking about the history of immigration. When we look at legal practices dealing with immigration, it's an enormous problem. It seems insoluble. We have people who are in desperate situations who want to come here. We can't, or I don't know how we assimilate those people. What kind of immigration policy would you see today? Because unless we can assimilate people, how can we keep our society moving forward?
Did this group hear the question? Okay.
Well, I think that immigrants become assimilated kind of from the get-go, and that they slowly, or not so slowly, acquire the skills they need. They acquire a kind of sense of being American. Their children go to school. They become English speakers, and if anything, as in all those other immigrations in the past, the problem is always the gap between the parents who speak one language and the children who are they're American. They participate in American popular culture. They when in the past they were called upon to serve in the military, they did, and these were the people who were defined as unassimilable. And from the point of view of the group, like various ethnic communities, they actually thought the assimilation into America was going way too fast, and that people were losing that which was distinctive. And I don't think there's any evidence that the process is any slower now than it was in 1920 or 1900 or 1880. And it may be that the power of, in fact, popular culture, it makes it even faster. And most immigrants coming now know much more about America than was true 100 years ago.
But I'm really asking also about policy. We cannot take everyone who wants to come immediately. How do we deal with that? What sort of policy do you see as appropriate today?
You want to?
It's funny because I think even if we just enforced the really restrictive immigration policy that the U.S. has right now, we would have more immigrants coming in. I mean, right now, there's so many exceptions to an immigration policy that is already very selective. Like, currently, U.S. immigration policy focuses on two groups. Immigrants who are highly skilled and immigrants with family connections, right? Even though at a practical level, it seems that the United States really also wants immigrants who are not necessarily highly skilled or have connections, right? But right now, even that is not being observed, right? And so I think the rhetoric around immigration right now, like 100 years ago, is really about something else. There is really a concern, perhaps a cultural concern, right, about how will they change American society. But there is no evidence.
Absolutely.
That, I mean, I actually think we have a counter argument. Look at what's happening in Britain with Brexit. One of the drivers was anti-immigrant sentiment. And now, boy, are they missing those immigrants. Because it turns out that the economy, one of the reasons why they're in a recession is because there's a whole slew of jobs that no one wants to do and that immigrants traditionally did.
I mean, I certainly would make no policy, suggestions, because it's just not in my wheelhouse at all. But I have to say, again, in that kind of moment when I said yes to Yale, there was on one of, again, these listservs, and maybe it was from the Immigration Ethnic History Society, no, it was after the inauguration, there had been something in the news that said that Nordstrom's was no longer going to carry, I know, Ivana Trump's clothing. I mean, I didn't even know there was a clothing line, but I read that. And then somebody wrote in and said, by the way, the first John W. Nordstrom, who came to the United States, wrote a little memoir for his family called My Life as an Immigrant. And I thought, oh, how fascinating. And I went on Amazon, I assume, and I found the book, and I bought it for $16 or whatever. And he tells the story. I mean, he was a total ne'er-do-well, no idea of how he's going to make it in America. And at one point, he and a friend, they spent some time in jail. They go to the iron ore mines in Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, and they heard they were hiring, and so they go to the boss and say they want jobs, and the boss says, that's great, because only you immigrants, only you Swedes and bohunks, meaning Bohemians, will take it. No American will take these jobs. Okay, and now how much of the sort of output of American industry was dependent on that iron ore from the Michigan Upper Peninsula? They're not skilled, they had nothing, but they were willing to do that work. That quote, as the boss said, no Americans will do that work. Now, the United States, if we think it needed to have become or should have become this major industrial power, that's another conversation. Right. But we would say it did happen. Without immigrant labor, it would have never happened. And these were the people who were, again, viewed as utterly unassimilable and were going to bring down the American standard of living. But on the contrary, what they did is they brought up the American standard of living by fostering productivity.
Please.
Hi, so when you say, unassimilable, I guess I would like to know, like, if the goalpost for what assimilated means has changed or keeps moving, and like, at what point do you consider someone, assimilated, and why the burden would be on immigrants to assimilate rather than for American culture to kind of absorb?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Should I repeat? So essentially, she's asking how what it means to assimilate has changed, if it has changed over time, why and what that means. But more importantly, she's asking whose burden is it, right? Is it just on the immigrants or on American society as well?
Well, it's not about my opinion on who should have changed, but certainly it was a society that had a very clear definition of what it meant to be American. English speaking, even though it was never in a formal, there's no official language, and loyalty, a sense of buying into a set of values about independence and about progress, and individualism. Okay, I mean, all very vague, because who knows what those really mean. For better or for worse, I mean, it was the burden was on the immigrants to prove, there was no test, by the way. So again, to become become naturalized and to become a citizen in those days was really easy. And there weren't, you didn't have to prove you had any of those values, but the sense was, and I think the immigrants themselves, certainly their children, they want to be American. Okay, they don't want to replicate the ways of life of their parents and grandparents, and they become comfortable in an English-speaking, individualistic, kind of progress-oriented society. There's a hand back there. One of my
Please, go ahead.
students.
Hello, Professor Diner. Very nice to see you.
Me too.
I wanted to ask you a question. I haven't read the book, so maybe this question would be useless if I actually read this. But I was wondering, you were speaking earlier about different stories, different choices, different points of view that a historian and researcher can choose while preparing, researching, or just writing a book on the subject of immigration, for instance. And I was wondering, was there any particular point of view, any particular stories that you and your co-author tried to privilege, for instance, in this book? What were your choices in this?
Okay, I'm not.
Sorry.
Oh,
Should I repeat? So she's asking if there were specific themes, right, and threads that Hasia and point of views, right, that they privileged as authors, essentially.
Well, I would say that, I mean, I hadn't thought about that. So you always ask challenging questions in class as well. I mean, I think both of us went into this project with a sense that, to answer Kevin's question before, that immigration was a good thing. Okay, that it made the nation more interesting, it made it richer in a kind of cultural sense, that barriers are bad. And that while, and this is in a way maybe a little bit also of an answer to Judith's question, it may be that societies do have to have some kind of standards. I don't know. I mean, I don't do, but certainly from the middle of the 20th century on, that I can't answer. But I think we both went into this thinking that immigration had been a good thing, and that we both wanted to, in our own very small way, use the politics of this moment to defend immigration and to defend it against the rhetoric out there, and to indicate that those politicians and those who listen to them, who base their arguments on the demonization of immigrants, are just, in a way, they're on one level not worthy of even being answered, but they have to be answered. And that was, I think, this with. Did we shy away from any topics because of that? I don't think so.
I also want to say that if Carl were here, he would probably urge us to think about refugees and asylees, right?
Right.
I think this is, and this is not just true in the United States, but right now we should have serious conversations, right? Because the distinctions across those groups are becoming looser rather than clearer, right? Especially if you consider climate change and everything. And so I'm pretty sure that he would say that we should think differently about this, right? And that a lot of the rhetoric, even though they say immigrants, but they're really talking about refugees and asylum seekers, right? And so I think there is a really urgent need to have a serious conversation about what the terms we use about people who move right now.
Right, although that also could be a conversation we could take back to the 1930s.
Right.
And that the need for refugee, and there was no refugee policy.
Exactly, right.
And there's really no refugee policy until basically the Cold War.
And that's what's so interesting about today. A lot of the refugee policies that we have were set by the United States, and now the United States is kind of recanting them. And a lot of countries around the world are kind of following America's lead, which is, right, creating, I mean, we've never had these many barriers as we have right now in the world.
There was a hand back there also.
I
Yeah,
think Hannah was
okay,
first.
yes,
Sorry,
okay,
Hannah,
I'm sorry.
Hannah, go ahead.
Hi. So arguably the flip side of immigration is the specter of deportation. Have you noticed shifts in the rhetoric surrounding deportation in the period you cover and the present day?
So if you didn't hear, she wants to know about changes in
The
the rhetoric surrounding deportation in the period that they cover in the book.
Right, so that, again, I would think Carl would be in a better place to answer than I. And I would say that even in the period that I feel pretty good about for myself, the fear of deportation was there until people became citizens. And one of the motivating factors for many immigrants to get their naturalization papers and to become citizens was to avoid that kind of confrontation with the kind of specter of deportation. And many of the ethnic communities, which is not, we only wrote about this slippery concept or category called ethnicity, in as much as immigrant communities all organized around protecting immigrants within their among their own. And one of the things they worked on, or one of the things they organized, was to protect people who were liable for deportation. And so it was a kind of protective measure. How it's changed, again, I think surveillance makes it completely different, in that it's really hard to hide. It's hard to hide. You can't just change your name and assume some other identity and sort of fit into blend into the population.
I think it's also that the bureaucracy is stronger, right?
Right.
100 years ago, much of this, you had the laws, but you didn't have the infrastructure or the people to enforce it. And now it's the opposite, right? I mean, the budget is
Huge.
humongous, right? And it keeps expanding as a force. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm wondering if you see the American immigration context as being necessarily unique, or whether you see some of these phenomena that you have in the book happening elsewhere around the world.
So she's asking if the American context in relation to immigration is unique to the United States, or is it happening also elsewhere?
Well, that's, I mean, in some ways, it's a topic we didn't discuss, just for lack, that was not our charge. Certainly, the United States was not the only country to which immigrants went or are going. And at different times, other countries became attractive. And the United States, some Americans like to claim that this is a uniquely American story. And on one hand, it's not, because immigrants were also going to Argentina, and they were going to Canada, and they were going to Australia, and so on. But the percentage of, in the European context, which is what I feel I know the best, who chose the United States was greater, and the variety of groups that came. And I think to some places like Canada or Argentina, there was a much, there were many fewer different populations going there. So going to Argentina was primarily Italians, okay, some Romanian Jews, and Spaniards, but the United States didn't have any one group that dominated, and that's one of the things that made the story so fascinating, is that it was the magnet for such a diverse set of peoples. And now I think that probably refugees are they have to be more strategic, because some countries have had much more benign policies than the United States, much more open policies. But it is an important topic that we only hint at.
I think we have time for, okay, so I'll get one.
We can run to 8:15.
Okay, okay, so we have at least 3 more questions.
okay
I'm gonna go one from here, and then you, and then the person in the back.
Okay.
Wait. But I actually wanted to mention that oftentimes what the United States does is followed by other countries. A really good example is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese exclusion becomes a global phenomenon, and we have now plenty of evidence that shows that politicians were kind of exchanging ideas, and oftentimes even talking about, it's like, look, just frame it in this way. This is the rhetorical tool that you can use, and it becomes more and more common the closer you get to the present, that the U.S. really shapes.
Although it's interesting that Britain passed the Aliens Act almost 2 decades before the United States, that was 1905. So in the way the United States sort of followed Britain's model.
But the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Oh, not for the Chinese,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Go ahead.
Hi.
I'd like to know how you and Carl chose to balance the 2 sides of the immigration story, the entering the country and the subsequent life of the immigrant, and if the amount of space that you gave to each of those changed over the course of the centuries that you covered.
Right. So we made a decision.
Sorry, did you guys hear? So he's asking how they managed the immigrant story, right, and the immigrant experience, if it's equal or more prevailed more than the other.
So, I mean, it's a great question, and we decided that the second part of that was not our mission. That was not our project, other than, that is, how immigrants built communities and established new or created new kind of cultural practices or political practices. We said that was not our project. That would be a book about, let's call it ethnicity. But we did deal with the their American lives as they as they structure their communities around servicing their immigrants from their homeland in the United States and protecting themselves politically from restriction. So that was a decision, that this was a book about the process, okay, rather than the what happens down the road. And I think one of our criticisms of much of the literature that came before, it was a kind of sloppy blend of those 2 stories, and I think they are to some degree different.
Go ahead.
So in the vein of what is uniquely American, assimilation, a little bit of American society, do you think that the importance of assimilation in the American immigration story is unique to American society compared to, let's say, other English-speaking countries that are popular for immigration, like England, Canada, Australia? And if so, do you think that might be hindering the evolution of American society in this moment?
Did you all hear? Yes? No.
Okay.
So she's asking if is it unique to the United States to emphasize assimilation compared to other English-speaking countries that receive immigrants? I might broaden that to more other multicultural societies. And then I forget the second part.
If so, do you think it's kind of
And is that if the U.S. is currently emphasizing assimilation so much, is that an issue, right, in hindering the further development of American society?
Well, that would again require that I knew a great deal about England, Australia, South Africa, I just couldn't make that claim at all. But the standards for becoming a citizen were historically much easier in the United States than any of those other places, and for the most part, and this goes a little bit to Noah's question, the kind of celebration within the group of ethnicity within these various communities tended to be much more overt and much more exuberant. And I don't know, are there St. Patrick's Day parades in other parts of the English-speaking world? There are? Okay. So, I mean, I think that's really, that would be a really interesting project to look at that. But I think the United States, because of the vast numbers of quote groups, whatever a group means, had the impact of both allowing for the performance of ethnicity, at the same time fostering this, I don't even necessarily like the word assimilation, I probably want to use the word integration.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a rich literature urging us not to use the word assimilation.
Yeah.
Right? Because if we have perhaps to choose a term that implies that it's a process where everyone is involved, right? Both sides is involved. Someone else, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Richard. I have two questions. One of them is with the rising of populism, the first thing that usually comes up is immigration and to make people fear of immigrants. Is there any way, any policies in particular that can do something about it? Like, I'm not talking about like just education, but like the first thing that comes into my mind is making a second language much more pressing matter and more mandatory than it is now, to make people realize that this is a country of immigrants after all. Like there are very few native Americans here. And my second question is, you mentioned a lot of times that the standard and the procedure of becoming a citizen became much harder through time. But I don't think you mentioned why that happened. So these are my two questions.
Okay, so just for the second.
Sorry, I have to repeat both of them.
I've done that every time.
Sorry, no, it's okay. And I hate to interrupt you every time.
Okay.
So the first question is about essentially what can we do to dispel, right, this anxiety about immigrants at a policy level, right? Which I think is a question that every multicultural society asks itself. And then the second one was,
Why did it become much harder?
why is it harder to become a citizen? Why does it get harder over time to become a citizen?
Okay, so as to the first, I mean, I'd say the important thing is to vote for candidates who are sympathetic to these kinds of issues. And in all of the places where we work and the institutions that we participate in, to be constantly conscious of the fact that it isn't a singular monolithic society. I'm not a policymaker, and so I'm really have no ability to answer that, again, other than people should use their political power to interrogate and to make their the candidates and to make their voices heard, that this matters to them. And I mean, I think interestingly in these midterms, I'm not sure immigration functioned at all as much of an issue. So the reason naturalization of citizenship became harder is that after the imposition of these restrictive laws, there was a larger population of people who were undocumented and therefore not qualified to apply for naturalization and citizenship. So that when the policy was relatively open for Europeans, there was no barrier to naturalization and citizenship. But once these communities become, or once we see the influx of people who aren't qualified because of the law, okay, they would be qualified in every other way, then there are many people who are just not able to naturalize and become citizens.
I think we're running out of time, but I would also add that there is a racial component to this evolution, right? So from the very beginning, the United States was committed to making the naturalization process easy for white immigrants. The moment the immigrant population became more diverse, so it's interesting, right? The U.S., yes, there's this myth of being a nation of immigrants, but not for every immigrant, right? And so by the time we get to the 19th century, there is a real dilemma at the heart of American identity. It's like, we understand that we need immigrants, we just don't want all of them to become citizens. And so by the time you get to 1924, sorry to go back to it so many times, but the 1924 Immigration Act says you can't come unless you're eligible to naturalize, which essentially excluded most immigrants from Asia, for example. Immigrants from the Western Hemisphere were exempted, but 2 days later, after the passage of the 1924 Act, the Border Patrol is created, right? And so that was meant to send yet another signal, right? Even though you can travel, you're not necessarily encouraged to become a citizen of the United States. And in fact, for the longest time, they preferred if, for example, Mexican immigrants would go back and forth rather than settle, essentially. But the policy question that you ask, I think it's the million-dollar question that every multicultural society asks. France, for example, says, you're just French. Forget about, where you come from. There's no hyphenated identity. Canada has a really robust integration, like immigrants go to school, right? And it's government, it's a federal policy, right? The United States kind of falls in between, and I'm not quite sure that any of them is a perfect model. So it's a question that every single country that receives large numbers of immigrants asks, and I'm not quite sure that we have an answer. I think this is the last one. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for this. So, in the story of American immigration, there are usually the two main characters, the immigrants and the state. So the immigrants arrive and then states respond, and the new immigrants adapt to the new policies. So I noticed the book is about the personal experience of immigrant groups, but also the state response. So my question is, what do you think act as the protagonist of the U.S. immigration story?
Should I repeat? So who is the main character of the U.S. immigrant story? Is it the immigrant or the state?
That's a great question, and that's also a question of what do you say first, because they're kind of like they're both co-protagonists, or there's neither one of them is supporting characters, but I think the story we wanted to tell was about the immigrants. And the immigrants confronted and confront state structures. But we wanted to tell the story of these people. And now again, Carl and I had a very different, my orientation was the people. His, now partly because he dealt with the later period, and I dealt with a period that, certainly until the Chinese Exclusion Act, had very little of the sort of state as a, playing much of a role at all. But, and so it may be that there is a kind of reason for our different structures. It's also our different temperaments and our different intellectual orientations. But I think in the end, we wanted to tell the story about immigrants and how they confronted these state players. And what did they do knowing what they knew, and how did they work around it? How did their communities organize to undermine those policies, and the like?
And just very briefly, this is also a way to give immigrants agency, right? Because we're so often seeing immigration through the state and the policies, but we're kind of missing the other side. Right? Thank you. Okay. This was amazing.